What if the most beautiful thing in the galaxy was considered hideous by every other species except humans? What if one simple act of kindness could spark an interstellar incident that would change the course of galactic history? In a universe where humanity is the newest member of an ancient galactic confederation, where beauty standards are dictated by crystalline beings and scaled overlords, one human maintenance worker is about to discover that sometimes the most profound connections happen when you're not trying to impress anyone. This is the story of how a dropped wrench, a moment of genuine human decency, and the galaxy's most misunderstood being would unite to prove that humanity's greatest strength isn't our technology or our weapons. It's our ability to see beauty where others see only flaws. Get ready for a tale that will challenge everything you think you know about first contact, interspecies relations, and the true meaning of beauty in a cosmos that's about to learn why humans are the most dangerous species in the galaxy. Not because we're warriors, but because we're the only ones who dare to care. Marcus Chun wiped the sweat from his forehead as he crawled through another narrow maintenance tunnel aboard Station Kepler 442b, the massive orbital platform that served as humanity's first embassy to the Galactic Confederation. The artificial gravity generators hummed beneath the deck plates, their vibrations traveling through his bones as he worked. 3 months into his assignment, and he still couldn't believe he was here, floating in space around an alien world, fixing things that kept thousands of beings from dozens of species alive. The irony wasn't lost on him. Back on Earth, he'd been just another repair technician struggling to make rent in Neo Singapore. Now, he was part of the most important diplomatic mission in human history, even if his role was to crawl through spaces too small for most other species and make sure the toilets flushed properly. His comm unit crackled to life. Chun, we've got a coolant leak in Section 7G. The Zephyrian delegation is complaining about temperature fluctuations. Marcus sighed and checked his tablet. Section 7G was in the diplomatic quarters, where the real important people lived and worked. He gathered his tools and made his way through the station's corridors, noting how other species moved aside when they saw his human maintenance uniform. Not out of respect, but out of the kind of polite distance that he'd grown accustomed to. Humans were new to the galactic community, barely 5 years since first contact. They were tolerated rather than welcomed, seen as primitive creatures who had somehow stumbled into space travel before they were ready. The fact that humanity had developed faster-than-light travel independently had surprised everyone, but it hadn't earned them much respect. If anything, it had made the older species nervous. The diplomatic levels of the station were a marvel of engineering, designed to accommodate the environmental needs of dozens of different species. The corridors here were wider, the ceilings higher, and everything was built to impress. Holographic art from various worlds flickered along the walls, and the air recycling system carried hints of exotic atmospheres that made Marcus slightly lightheaded. He found a maintenance access panel and was surprised to discover it was located in what appeared to be a communal garden area. The space was beautiful, with plants from various worlds creating a patchwork of impossible colors and strange geometries. The leak was minor, just a fitting that had worked loose due to thermal expansion. Easy fix. As he worked, Marcus became aware of soft crying sounds coming from somewhere in the garden. He paused, listening. The sound was definitely distressed, but unlike anything he'd heard from the various species he'd encountered so far. His curiosity got the better of him, and he followed the sound deeper into the garden. What he found made him stop dead in his tracks. Sitting alone on a bench carved for what looked like crystallized starlight was the most beautiful being Marcus had ever seen. She was humanoid, but clearly not human, with skin that seemed to shift between deep purple and midnight blue depending on how the light hit it. Her hair cascaded down her back like liquid silver, and when she looked up at his approach, he saw eyes that held the depth of nebulae, swirling with points of light like distant stars. She was crying, and the tears that fell from those cosmic eyes sparkled like diamonds before they hit the ground and evaporated into wisps of luminescent vapor. "Oh," she said, her voice like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "I'm sorry. I didn't know anyone was here. I'll leave." She started to rise, but Marcus found his voice. "No, wait. Please. You don't have to leave. I'm just fixing a coolant leak." He gestured vaguely toward the maintenance panel. Are you okay? You seemed upset. The being looked at him with genuine surprise, as if the question itself was unexpected. You're human, aren't you? Marcus Chun, he said, offering what he hoped was a reassuring smile. And, yes, very human. Maintenance Division. I am Alexandra of the Luminari, she replied formally, then seemed to catch herself. But you can call me ZYX. And to answer your question, I suppose I am okay. Though that depends on your definition of okay. Marcus finished tightening the coolant fitting, but didn't move to leave. Something about this ZYX drew him in. Maybe it was her obvious distress, or maybe it was simply that she was the first person on the station who seemed willing to have an actual conversation with him. Would you like to talk about it? He asked. I mean, I'm just a maintenance guy, so I'm probably not the best person to ask for advice, but sometimes talking helps. ZYX looked at him for a long moment, those stellar eyes searching his face. You really don't know, do you? Know what? What I am? Well, my people think of me. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. I suppose humans wouldn't have learned about our internal politics yet. Marcus sat down on the bench beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. I know the Luminari are one of the older species in the Confederation. Beyond that, not much. We're still pretty new to all this. The Luminari value beauty above all else, ZYX explained, her voice growing quieter. Our entire culture, our social structure, even our government, is based on aesthetic perfection. The most beautiful among us rule, the moderately attractive serve in various capacities, and the ugly, she gestured to herself, are hidden away. Marcus blinked in confusion. Hidden away? But he struggled for words. You're the most beautiful person I've ever seen. ZYX stared at him as if he just claimed the laws of physics were optional. What did you say? I said you're beautiful. Incredibly beautiful. I mean, I hope that's not inappropriate to say. I don't know the cultural protocols for compliments between species, but Marcus realized he was rambling and forced himself to stop. You think I'm beautiful? ZYX's voice was barely above a whisper. Are you kidding? You're absolutely stunning. Your skin looks like the aurora borealis. Your hair is like liquid moonlight. And your eyes. God, your eyes are like looking at the birth of stars. For a moment, ZYX said nothing. Then, to Marcus's alarm, she began crying harder. Oh no, Marcus said quickly. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said anything. I didn't mean to make you more upset. You're not making me upset, ZYX managed between sobs. It's just, no one has ever said that to me before. Ever. Among my people, I am considered grotesque. My coloring is all wrong. My proportions are considered hideous. My features are asymmetrical according to Luminari standards. I was sent here to this station as punishment, to keep me away from Luminari space where my appearance might offend others. Marcus felt a surge of anger on her behalf. That's insane. How could anyone think you're anything but gorgeous? Because beauty is relative, ZYX said, wiping her eyes with what looked like silk handkerchief that sparkled as it absorbed her luminescent tears. What one species finds attractive, another finds repulsive. It's basic xenobiology. Maybe, Marcus said, but that doesn't make their opinion more valid than anyone else's. And, in my opinion, you're the most beautiful being I've encountered in this entire galaxy. ZYX looked at him again with that same searching expression. You really mean that? Every word. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the exotic plants sway in the artificial breeze generated by the station's environmental systems. Marcus found himself stealing glances at her, still amazed that anyone could consider her anything but breathtaking. What about you? ZYX asked suddenly. What brings a human maintenance worker to the point of crawling through coolant pipes in space? Marcus laughed. Honestly, blind luck and a complete lack of better options. I was fixing air conditioning units in Singapore when humanity made first contact. Turns out the skills transfer pretty well to life support systems, and they needed people who were comfortable working in small spaces. Most humans are too claustrophobic for the really tight maintenance areas. And you're not. I grew up in a family of 12 in a tiny apartment. I'm used to cramped spaces. Marcus grinned. Plus, the pay is amazing, and I get to see wonders that no human in history has ever seen before. Worth a little discomfort. Wonders, ZYX repeated thoughtfully. I hadn't thought of it that way. This station has been my prison for 6 months. I see it as exile, not exploration. Maybe it's both, Marcus suggested. Maybe sometimes the best adventures start with being forced out of your comfort zone. His comm unit buzzed. Chin, what's your status on that coolant leak? Marcus checked his watch and was surprised to see that nearly an hour had passed. Fixed and verified, he reported, heading back to maintenance. As he started to gather his tools, ZYX spoke up. Marcus? Thank you for listening and for what you said. It meant more than you know. Would it be okay if I came back sometime? Maybe we could talk again. For the first time since he'd met her, ZYX smiled. When she did, Marcus was certain that every light in the garden grew brighter. I would like that very much. Marcus made his way back to the maintenance section in a daze, barely aware of where he was walking. He'd had conversations with other species before, but they'd always been brief, professional exchanges. This had been different. This had felt like talking to another person, not just another alien. When he arrived back at maintenance, his supervisor, Chief Rodriguez, looked up from her desk. You were gone a while for a simple coolant leak. It was a bit tricky, Marcus said, which wasn't entirely a lie. Well, make sure you log it properly. The brass is all worked up about efficiency reports. Apparently, some of the alien diplomats have been complaining that human maintenance staff are too slow. Marcus nodded and headed to his workstation, but he found it hard to concentrate on his reports. His mind kept drifting back to the garden, to stellar eyes and liquid silver hair, to a voice like wind chimes, and the way she'd looked at him when he'd called her beautiful. He was so lost in thought that he almost missed the commotion when it started. The first sign of trouble was Chief Rodriguez's comm unit erupting with chatter from security. Then, the general alarm began sounding, a low, pulsing tone that meant diplomatic emergency. All maintenance staff report to emergency stations, Rodriguez called out. We've got a situation developing in the diplomatic quarter. Marcus grabbed his emergency toolkit and joined the flow of personnel heading for their assigned positions. As they moved through the corridors, he caught fragments of conversation from the security teams. Luminari delegation is furious. Claims of inappropriate contact, demanding immediate investigation. Marcus felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. He had a terrible feeling he knew what this was about. The maintenance emergency station for his section was located near the diplomatic quarters, close enough that he could see the commotion developing outside the Luminari embassy suite. A crowd of beings in flowing robes that seemed to be cut from pieces of rainbow were gesturing animatedly while speaking in rapid, melodious voices to a harried-looking human diplomat. Absolutely unacceptable for a human to approach one of our people without proper authorization. One of the Luminari was saying as Marcus drew closer. I assure you, Ambassador Veltar, we will investigate this matter thoroughly, the human diplomat replied. If one of our staff behaved inappropriately, the Luminari ambassador's voice rose. A maintenance worker approached our Zwayaxandra and engaged her in unauthorized social contact. This is beyond inappropriate. This is scandalous. Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. They were talking about his conversation with ZYX. Somehow, what had seemed like a perfectly normal human interaction had become an interstellar incident. Furthermore, Ambassador Veltar continued, the human apparently made what can only be described as romantic overtures toward her. This is intolerable. We demand that this individual be identified and punished. The human diplomat looked like he wanted to disappear into the deck plating. Ambassador, I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding. There is no misunderstanding. Our cultural attaché witnessed the entire interaction. A human maintenance worker told our Zwayaxandra that she was beautiful. In our culture, such words are reserved for the highest forms of courtship ritual. This human has essentially proposed marriage to her in front of a witness. Marcus felt the universe tilt sideways. Marriage? He'd just been trying to be nice to someone who seemed upset. How had a simple compliment become a marriage proposal? But, even as his mind reeled, another part of him was focused on something else the ambassador had said. A witness had seen the interaction. Someone had been watching them in the garden. We demand justice, Ambassador Veltar declared. This human has compromised the honor of Zwayaxandra. There must be consequences. Marcus realized he was at a crossroads. He could remain silent, let the diplomats handle it, hope that somehow the whole thing would blow over. Or he could step forward and take responsibility for his actions. The decision was made easier by the memory of Zwax's face when he'd called her beautiful, the way she'd lit up at words that were apparently the first kind ones she'd heard in years. Marcus stepped forward from the crowd of maintenance workers. "That would be me," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the diplomatic area. "I'm a maintenance worker who spoke with Zwaxandra." Every eye in the corridor turned to look at him. The Luminari ambassador's robes shifted through several shades of what Marcus was beginning to suspect were the alien equivalent of angry colors. "You," Ambassador Veltar said, pointing at Marcus with one long, elegant finger. "You are the one who dared to speak romantic words to our Zwaxandra." Marcus straightened his shoulders and looked the ambassador directly in the eye. "I'm the one who told her she was beautiful, yes. And I meant every word." The gasp that followed his statement could probably be heard 3 decks away. Ambassador Veltar's robes cycled through what had to be the entire spectrum of outrage. "You admit it. In front of witnesses, you admit to proposing marriage to our Zwaxandra. If telling someone they're beautiful counts as a marriage proposal in your culture," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around him, "then yes, I guess I proposed. But I should probably point out that in human culture, it's just basic decency to be kind to someone who's crying alone in a garden." "Marcus," Chief Rodriguez hissed from somewhere behind him. "What are you doing?" What was he doing? Marcus wasn't entirely sure, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He wasn't going to let ZYX suffer anymore because someone had shown her a moment of kindness. "I'm taking responsibility for my actions," he said, still looking at the Luminari ambassador. "What happens now?" The emergency session of the Diplomatic Council convened 3 hours after Marcus's public confession, and he found himself sitting in the most important room on the station, surrounded by beings whose decisions shaped the fate of civilizations. The irony that 12 hours ago he'd been worried about a loose coolant fitting was not lost on him. Ambassador Sarah Chun, humanity's chief representative to the Galactic Confederation, and, purely by coincidence, Marcus's distant cousin, sat at the head of the human delegation looking like she'd aged 10 years in the past few hours. Across from her, Ambassador Veltar of the Luminari occupied a chair that seemed to be carved from a single massive crystal, his rainbow robes shifting through agitated patterns. Representatives from a dozen other species filled this circular chamber, their various forms and technologies creating a scene that would have belonged in the wildest science fiction movie. The Zephyrians hovered in energy fields, the Chronari delegation sat in temperature-controlled pods, and the crystalline Vithrak communicated through harmonic frequencies that Marcus felt more than heard. At the center of it all sat Marcus, wearing his maintenance uniform and feeling supremely out of place among these titans of galactic diplomacy. "The situation is unprecedented," Ambassador Chun was saying, her voice carefully controlled. "While we acknowledge that cultural misunderstandings can occur between species, we must also recognize that maintenance technicians acted without knowledge of Luminari customs. Ignorance is not an excuse," Ambassador Veltar replied, his voice like music played on crystal chimes. "The human approached our Zwaxandra without authorization and made declarations that, in our culture, constitute a formal marriage proposal. The cultural attaché who witnessed this interaction confirms that the human's words were, and I quote, 'You're the most beautiful being I've encountered in this entire galaxy.'" A ripple of what Marcus assumed was shock passed through the assembled delegates. Several species began conferring among themselves in various languages and communication methods. Furthermore, Veltar continued, "This proposal was made to one of our most problematic citizens. Zwaxandra has been placed in exile on this station precisely because her appearance is so offensive to Luminari sensibilities. For a human to claim she is beautiful is either a deliberate insult to our aesthetic standards or a sign of such alien perception that we must question whether meaningful cultural exchange is even possible." Marcus felt anger rising in his chest, but before he could speak, Ambassador Chun placed a warning hand on his arm. "Perhaps," Chun said diplomatically, "we could hear from Technician Chun himself about his intentions during this interaction." All eyes turned to Marcus again. He took a deep breath and stood, feeling like he was about to either save or destroy humanity's relationship with the galaxy. "Honored delegates," he began, "try to remember the formal address protocols they drilled into all human staff. I want to be clear about what happened. I was performing routine maintenance when I heard someone crying. When I investigated, I found ZYXandra alone and obviously distressed. As a human, my natural instinct was to see if she was okay and if I could help. And the marriage proposal prompted a delegate from the hegemony of scales, their voice emerging from a translation device with an odd mechanical quality. In human culture, telling someone they're beautiful isn't a marriage proposal, Marcus explained. It's just being decent. When someone is clearly upset about their appearance, you try to help them feel better. You tell them the truth as you see it. And what truth did you see? This question came from one of the Vithrak, their harmonic voice resonating through the chamber like singing crystal. Marcus looked around the room, meeting the eyes, sensors, and other optical organs of beings from across the galaxy. I saw the most beautiful person I'd ever encountered. Her skin looked like the aurora borealis. Her hair was like liquid moonlight, and her eyes held the birth of stars. That wasn't a line or a cultural ritual. That was just honest human perception. The chamber fell silent except for the hum of various life support systems and the quiet harmonics of the Vithrak delegation conferring among themselves. Finally, Ambassador Veltar spoke. You maintain that you find ZYXandra physically attractive? I don't understand how anyone couldn't, Marcus replied honestly. Another ripple passed through the chamber, and Marcus noticed that several delegates were now actively discussing among themselves. The energy in the room had shifted somehow, but he couldn't tell if that was good or bad. This presents an interesting problem, said the Zephyrian representative, their words emerging from crackling energy fields. If the human genuinely finds the Luminari exile attractive, and if human aesthetic standards are so fundamentally different from galactic norms, then we may need to reconsider how we approach cultural exchange protocols. Or interjected a new voice that made Marcus's heart skip a beat. You could simply ask me what I think about all this. Every being in the chamber turned to see ZYXandra standing in the entrance to the council chamber. She wore formal robes that seemed to be cut from starlight itself, and despite what she'd told him about being considered ugly, she carried herself with the bearing of royalty. ZYXandra, Ambassador Veltar, said sharply, "You were not summoned to this session." "No," she agreed, gliding into the chamber with fluid grace. "I was not. I was, however, locked in my quarters under guard while a room full of strangers debated my future and my honor. I decided that was unacceptable." Marcus noticed that several of the non-Luminari delegates were staring at ZYX with what he was beginning to recognize as fascination rather than revulsion. The hegemony representative actually adjusted their position to get a better view, and the Zephyrians' energy fields flickered in patterns that their translation protocols indicated as aesthetic appreciation. "The human," ZYX continued, "showed me kindness when I was in distress. He listened to my problems, offered comfort, and said kind words when I needed to hear them. If your cultural framework interprets basic human decency as a marriage proposal, perhaps the problem lies with the framework, not the human." "Sixandra Veltar Vanet, you 40th you shiv." "Do I?" she challenged. "Or am I finally remembering myself?" She turned to address the full chamber. "For my entire life, I've been told I am hideous by Luminari standards. I have been hidden away, exiled, made to feel ashamed of my very existence. Then a human maintenance worker looks at me and sees beauty. He doesn't see an exile or a political problem. He sees a person worth talking to, worth caring about." The Vithrak delegate's harmonics grew more complex. The exile speaks of human perception being fundamentally different from established galactic norms. "Exactly," ZYX said, which raises an important question. If humans see beauty where we see ugliness, what else might they see that we're missing? Marcus watched the delegates processing this, and he could almost see the gears turning in their collective minds. This had started as a diplomatic crisis, but it was evolving into something more complex. The Chronari delegate, whose species Marcus knew prized logic above all else, spoke from their environmental pod. The implications are significant. If human aesthetic perception differs so dramatically from established norms, their entire worldview may be fundamentally alien to current galactic understanding. Which brings us back to the central question, Ambassador Chun said, seizing the moment. How do we handle a situation where cultural misunderstanding has created an accidental marriage proposal according to one culture's standards, but not the others? "There is a precedent," said the hegemony delegate thoughtfully. The ritual of clarified intent, established after the Zephyrian-Chronari aesthetic wars 3 centuries ago. When two cultures have fundamentally different interpretations of the same interaction, both parties must formally state their intentions and desires. Ambassador Veltar's robes shifted to what Marcus was learning were skeptical colors. You suggest we apply ancient protocols to this situation? I suggest we apply proven solutions to complex problems, the hegemony delegate replied. Unless the Luminari prefer to have this incident strain their relationships with humanity and potentially other species who may share human aesthetic sensibilities? Marcus noticed that several other delegates nodded or made their species equivalent gestures of agreement. The political implications were clearly bigger than just his conversation with ZYX. Very well, Veltar said reluctantly. We will invoke the ritual of clarified intent. But this opens dangerous precedents. All growth involves risk, the Vithrak delegate harmonized. Ambassador Chun looked at Marcus. Technician Chun, you understand what this means? You'll need to formally state your intentions regarding Zawyxandra in front of the full council. Marcus nodded, though his mouth had gone dry. I understand. And Zawyxandra of the Luminari, the hegemony delegate addressed her directly, must also state your position clearly. Understand as well, she replied, her voice steady. The chamber fell silent as the ritual protocols were activated. Ancient holographic symbols appeared in the air above the council table, representing the formal framework for resolving cultural conflicts. Marcus had never imagined that his attempt to cheer up a crying person would lead to invoking thousand-year-old diplomatic procedures. Maintenance technician Marcus Chun of Earth, the ceremonial voice of the council's AI system, intoned, Please state your intentions regarding Zawyxandra of the Luminari. Marcus stood, acutely aware that his next words would be recorded in galactic diplomatic archives and potentially studied by xenosociologists for centuries. My intention, he said clearly, was to offer comfort to someone who was distressed. When I told Zawyxandra she was beautiful, I meant it as a statement of fact, not as a romantic proposition. However, he paused, looking directly at her across the chamber. If my words constitute a marriage proposal under Luminari law, then I want it understood that it was a proposal made with genuine respect and admiration. The chamber erupted in surprised murmurs and harmonics. Marcus had essentially just confirmed the proposal while simultaneously explaining it away. And you, Zawyxandra of the Luminari, the AI prompted. ZYX stood, her starlight robes flowing around her like captured aurora. My intention is to accept the human's proposal, whether it was meant as one or not. The silence that followed was deafening. Ambassador Veltar was the first to find his voice. Zawyxandra, you cannot be serious. I'm entirely serious, she replied. For the first time in my life, someone has looked at me and seen beauty instead of ugliness, worth instead of shame. If that person is willing to stand by his words, even in front of the Galactic Council, then yes, I accept his proposal. Marcus felt his knees go weak. This was not how he'd expected his day to go when he'd woken up to fix a coolant leak. The hegemony delegate made a sound that their translator interpreted as thoughtful consideration. The ritual requires mutual consent and clear statement of terms. Both parties have provided this. The proposal is now formally recognized under galactic law. This is madness, Veltar protested. She is exiled for good reason. Her appearance, interrupted the Vithrak delegate with complex harmonics that carried undercurrents of aesthetic appreciation, seems to be a matter of cultural perspective rather than objective reality. We find her quite pleasing to observe. As do we, added the Zephyrian representative. Her energy patterns are remarkably harmonious. Marcus realized that something fundamental had just shifted in the chamber. The other species were publicly disagreeing with Luminari aesthetic standards. What had started as a crisis about cultural misunderstanding was becoming a challenge to established galactic beauty norms. Ambassador Chun, demonstrating the diplomatic skills that had gotten her this position, stepped into the moment. Perhaps this situation provides an opportunity for broader cultural exchange. If human aesthetic perception is indeed so different from current galactic standards, it might be valuable to explore those differences more systematically. You're suggesting formal study? Asked the Chronari delegate. I'm suggesting that this incident might be the beginning of a much larger conversation about diversity, beauty, and cultural understanding in our galactic community. Marcus watched Ambassador Veltar's robes cycle through what had to be the visual equivalent of a diplomatic headache. The Luminari were clearly losing control of the narrative, and Marcus suspected that was exactly what Ambassador Chun had intended. There will need to be formal arrangements, Veltar said finally. If this marriage is to be recognized, there must be proper protocols, ceremonies, cultural exchanges. This cannot simply be declared and forgotten. Of course, ZYX said smoothly. I'm sure Marcus, and I will be happy to participate in whatever cultural exchange programs the council deems appropriate. Marcus managed not to faint, though it took considerable effort. Somehow, his simple act of kindness had escalated into an interstellar marriage, a challenge to galactic beauty standards, and what sounded like it was about to become a formal research program into human aesthetic perception. As the delegates began discussing the logistics of unprecedented interspecies marriage protocols, Marcus caught ZYX's eye across the chamber. She smiled at him, that radiant expression that had nearly blinded him in the garden, and he realized that whatever complications lay ahead, he regretted nothing. After all, he told her the truth when he said she was beautiful. If the galaxy wanted to make a diplomatic crisis out of honesty, that was their problem. The question now was what came next, and Marcus had a feeling it was going to be unlike anything in the history of human-alien relations. 2 weeks after what the galactic news networks had dubbed the beauty incident, Marcus found himself living in quarters that were roughly 10 times larger than his original maintenance bunk, with a view of the planet below that probably cost more than his yearly salary. The irony that his housing upgrade had come about because he'd accidentally gotten engaged to an alien was not lost on him. The diplomatic quarters assigned to him and ZYX were designed to accommodate the needs of interspecies couples, a category that had apparently existed in theory, but never in practice until now. The result was a living space that looked like it had been designed by committee, with sections adapted for various environmental needs, cultural preferences, and physiological requirements. Marcus was discovering that being accidentally engaged to a member of one of the galaxy's most influential species came with complications he'd never imagined. You need to understand, Ambassador Chan was explaining during their third briefing session this week, that your situation has become something of a galactic phenomenon. The news networks from 47 different species have requested interviews. The Vithrak Aesthetic Council wants to commission a study. 3 different universities want to establish xenobiology research programs based on human perception studies. Marcus, who was trying to eat breakfast while processing information that made his head spin, nearly choked on his coffee. I just told someone they were pretty. How did that become a research program? Because, ZYX said from across their shared living area, you challenged 5,000 years of established aesthetic doctrine without even realizing it. She was working on what appeared to be some kind of holographic art project, creating swirling patterns of light that responded to her movements. Do you know how many species have contacted the Luminari Embassy asking about aesthetic perception studies since our engagement was announced? How many? All of them. Marcus set down his coffee and looked at his accidentally acquired fiancée. Over the past 2 weeks, he'd learned that ZYX was not just beautiful, but brilliant, with advanced degrees in xenocultural studies and artistic theory. She'd been exiled not just for her appearance, but because her academic work had questioned traditional Luminari beauty standards. The fact that a human had independently validated her theories had made her something of a celebrity among progressive academics across the galaxy. The hegemony wants to establish a joint research station, Ambassador Chun continued, consulting her tablet. The Zephyrians are offering to fund a new wing of the Cultural Exchange Institute, and the Chronari want to run comprehensive psychological profiles on both of you to understand how emotional attachment can override established aesthetic programming. That sounds invasive, Marcus said. It is, ZYX agreed, her art project shifting to more agitated patterns. But it's also an unprecedented opportunity to challenge systems that have oppressed countless beings across the galaxy. Do you know how many individuals from various species have been considered aesthetically deficient by galactic standards? Marcus was beginning to get a sense of the scope. A lot. Approximately 30% of the galactic population falls into various categories of aesthetic nonconformity, ZYX explained. The beauty standards that dominate our civilization were established by the earliest spacefaring species and have never been seriously challenged because no one wanted to risk diplomatic incidents. Until now. Ambassador Chen said with a smile that Marcus was learning to recognize as dangerous. Your accidental proposal has opened a door that's been closed for millennia. The question is what we do with that opportunity. Before Marcus could respond, their door chimed with the complex harmony that indicated visitors from multiple species. Ambassador Chen checked her security display and sighed. The research delegation is here early. Marcus had been dreading this meeting. Over the past week, representatives from various galactic institutions had been arriving to discuss the establishment of what was being called the Human Aesthetic Perception Institute. The idea was to study why humans seem to have such radically different beauty standards from the rest of the galaxy. The door opened to admit what looked like a small parade. Dr. Velthara of the Vithrak Aesthetic Council came first, her crystalline body refracting the room's lights into rainbow patterns. Behind her floated Professor Zix of the Zephyrian Energy Dynamics Institute, crackling with contained electricity. The Chronari delegation was represented by Logiconator Prime Sequence Optimal Outcome, whose name Marcus had given up trying to pronounce correctly after the first day. Honored Chin Marcus, Dr. Velthara's harmonic voice filled the room. We hope this meeting time remains convenient for your schedule requirements. Of course, Marcus replied, still getting used to being addressed as if he were some kind of dignitary instead of a guy who fixed air conditioning. The research team had spent the past week conducting what they politely called aesthetic evaluation protocols, but which felt more like being asked to rate the attractiveness of a parade of aliens. Marcus had discovered that his taste in beauty was apparently so unusual by galactic standards that it was considered scientifically significant. We have preliminary results from your evaluation sessions, Professor Zix announced, their energy field flickering with what Marcus had learned indicated excitement. The data is remarkable. Logic Coordinator Prime Sequence Optimal Outcome activated a holographic display that filled the center of the room with complex charts and diagrams. Human subject Marcus Chin demonstrates aesthetic appreciation patterns that correlate with known galactic standard. Subjects rated as highly attractive by human evaluation scored in lowest percentiles according to established beauty metrics across all tested species. What they're saying, ZYX translated with obvious amusement, is that your taste in beauty is completely unique in galactic history. But here's what's really interesting, Dr. Velthara added, her harmonics shifting to academic enthusiasm. When we tested other humans on the station, we found similar patterns. Human aesthetic perception appears to be fundamentally different from all other known species. Marcus looked around the room, full of excited alien scientists. Is that good? It's revolutionary, Professor Zix crackled. For millennia, galactic civilization has operated under the assumption that beauty standards, while culturally influenced, had certain universal constants. Human perception suggests that assumption is completely wrong. Ambassador Chen leaned forward with interest. What are the implications? Massive social reform. Logic Coordinator Prime Sequence Optimal Outcome stated with typical Chronari directness. If beauty truly is relative rather than universal, then current aesthetic-based social hierarchies lack logical foundation. Governmental systems based on appearance standards may require complete restructuring. Marcus felt that familiar sensation of the universe tilting sideways. Are you saying that my opinion of ZYX's looks is going to cause political upheaval across the galaxy? Not just political upheaval, ZYX said, her art project now displaying what looked like celebratory fireworks. Social revolution, economic restructuring, cultural renaissance. Do you have any idea how many species have caste systems based on aesthetic hierarchy? I'm guessing more than I want to know about. Try most of them, Ambassador Chen said. The Luminari are actually one of the more moderate examples. Some species have legally codified beauty requirements for citizenship rights. Dr. Velthara's crystalline structure rang with harmonic emphasis. Human aesthetic perception could provide the theoretical foundation for challenging these systems. If beauty truly is cultural rather than universal, then aesthetic discrimination lacks scientific basis. Marcus sat back in his chair, trying to process the implications. 2 weeks ago, he'd been a maintenance worker whose biggest concern was keeping the toilets functioning. Now, he was apparently the inadvertent catalyst for Galactic's social revolution. There's something else, Professor Zix said, their energy field dimming to more serious patterns. Our research has attracted attention from some conservative elements within the galactic community. Not everyone is happy about challenges to established order. Threats? Ambassador Chen asked sharply. Not direct threats. Logic Coordinator Prime Sequence Optimal Outcome clarified. However, several traditional aesthetic councils have filed formal protests regarding research protocols. Some species governments have expressed concern about social destabilization. Marcus looked at ZYX, who had gone very still. What kind of concerns? The kind that suggests some people would prefer this research not continue, she said quietly. There are powerful interests invested in maintaining current aesthetic hierarchies. Challenging those hierarchies threatens their power base. Are we in danger? Marcus asked. Not physically, Ambassador Chen said. The diplomatic protections around this research are solid, but there will be pressure to limit the scope of the studies, to minimize their implications. Dr. Veltheraz's harmonics took on what Marcus was learning to recognize as determined resonance, which is why we must accelerate our timeline. The sooner we can publish comprehensive results, the harder it will be for conservative elements to suppress the findings. What does that mean for us? Marcus gestured between himself and Zyax. It means, Zyax said, standing and moving to join him, that our engagement has become more than personal. It's become political. Are you prepared for that? Marcus looked around the room at the assembled scientists, at Ambassador Chen's concerned face, at the holographic displays showing charts and graphs that represented his accidental challenge to galactic civilization. Then, he looked at Zyax, at her stellar eyes and liquid silver hair, at the being whose beauty had started this entire cascade of consequences. A few weeks ago, the most important decision I had to make was which wrench to use on a coolant fitting, he said. Now I'm accidentally leading a galactic civil rights movement. I'm not sure anyone could be prepared for that. But, ZYX prompted, but if challenging unfair beauty standards and helping people who've been discriminated against is the result of me telling the truth about how gorgeous you are, then I'm all in. The research team exchanged what Marcus was beginning to recognize as pleased approval across species lines. Ambassador Chen smiled with what looked like relief. ZYX moved closer to him, her presence seeming to brighten the room. Then, we should probably discuss the wedding. Wedding? Marcus's voice cracked slightly. The formal ceremony is scheduled for next month, she explained. Representatives from 63 species will attend. It's being broadcast across the Galactic Communication Network. The Vithrak are composing a special harmonic symphony for the occasion. Marcus stared at her. 63 species? Broadcast? I thought this was supposed to be a small cultural exchange ceremony. It was, Ambassador Chen said, until it became the most politically significant wedding in galactic history. The ceremony will formally establish the first recognized interspecies marriage based on human aesthetic perception. The precedent it sets will influence policy across the galaxy. No pressure, Marcus muttered. Professor Zix's energy field flickered with what might have been sympathy. The ceremony will also include formal presentation of our research findings. Your marriage will serve as the practical demonstration of our theoretical conclusions. So not only am I getting married in front of the entire galaxy, Marcus said slowly, but our wedding is also going to be a scientific conference. The most important scientific conference in galactic history, Dr. Velthera harmonized with obvious excitement. Marcus looked at ZYX again. Despite everything, despite the political implications and the scientific significance and the diplomatic complications, she was still the most beautiful being he'd ever seen. More than that, over the past 2 weeks of living together and navigating this impossible situation, he'd discovered that she was also brilliant, kind, funny, and shared his taste in 20th century human music. Okay, he said, let's get married and accidentally revolutionize galactic civilization. What's the worst that could happen? The assembled scientists and diplomats looked at each other with expressions that clearly suggested they could think of several things that could go wrong. But Marcus was looking at ZYX, who was smiling at him with that radiant expression that made every star in the galaxy seem dim by comparison, and he decided that whatever happened next, it would be worth it. The largest diplomatic hall on Station Kepler 442b had been transformed into something that looked like a dream collaboration between a wedding planner, a xenobiologist, and a theoretical physicist. Representatives from 63 species filled tiered seating areas designed to accommodate everything from gaseous energy beings to crystalline entities that required specific harmonic frequencies to maintain structural integrity. Marcus stood at the altar wearing what Ambassador Chun had assured him was formal human ceremonial attire. Though he suspected the suit had been modified with enough cultural symbols for various species to serve as a diplomatic statement. His hands were only shaking slightly, which he considered a personal victory given that approximately 4 billion beings across the galaxy were watching the live broadcast. The ceremony was being conducted according to a hybrid protocol that combined elements from dozens of different cultural traditions. The Vithrak had provided the harmonic framework, the Zephyrians had contributed energy field aesthetics, the Chronari had insisted on logical documentation procedures, and the humans had somehow managed to include flower arrangements. Nervous, Ambassador Chun asked quietly from her position as the ceremony's human cultural representative. Terrified, Marcus admitted, "A month ago I was fixing air conditioning units. Now I'm about to make interspecies history in front of half the galaxy." "Think of it as a really important repair job," she suggested. "You're fixing something that's been broken in galactic society for thousands of years." Before Marcus could respond, the ceremonial music began. The Vithrak Harmonic Council had composed something they called Resonance of Unity, which sounded like the birth of stars set to music. The assembled delegates rose or activated their species' equivalent of respectful attention. ZYX appeared at the far end of the hall, and Marcus forgot how to breathe. She was wearing a gown that seemed to be woven from captured starlight, flowing and shifting with colors that had no names in any human language. Her liquid silver hair had been arranged in a style that incorporated traditional elements from dozens of species, with small crystalline ornaments that caught the light and threw rainbow patterns across the walls. But it was her face that stopped Marcus's heart, glowing with happiness that made her more radiant than any star. As she walked down the aisle, Marcus became aware of a sound he'd never heard before. It took him a moment to realize it was the collective intake of breath from 63 different species as they got their first clear view of the being their societies had labeled as ugly. The whispers started immediately. "Magnificent," he heard from the hegemony delegation. "Energy patterns are absolutely harmonious," crackled from the Zephyrian section. "Aesthetic configuration demonstrates previously unrecognized optimization parameters," came from the Chronari observers. By the time ZYX reached the altar, it was clear that something fundamental had shifted in the hall. The assembled representatives were seeing her through new eyes, human eyes, and finding beauty where their cultural programming had taught them to see ugliness. Ambassador Veltar of the Luminari, who was serving as the ceremony's cultural liaison for ZYX's people, looked like he was experiencing some kind of philosophical crisis. His rainbow robes were cycling through colors that Marcus suspected indicated severe cognitive dissonance. "We are gathered," intoned the ceremony's AI coordinator, "to witness the formal union of two beings whose connection challenges established norms and opens new possibilities for understanding between species." Dr. Velthara of the Vithrak Council stepped forward, her crystalline form ringing with ceremonial harmonics. "This union represents more than personal commitment. It demonstrates the profound truth that beauty, value, and worth are not universal constants, but cultural constructs that can and should be questioned." Marcus and ZYX exchanged glances. Even their wedding ceremony had become a political statement. The formal vows began according to the hybrid protocol the diplomatic teams had developed. Each element was designed to respect the cultural requirements of various species while creating something entirely new. "Marcus Chun of Earth," the AI coordinator prompted, "please state your commitment according to human cultural tradition." Marcus had spent days working on his vows, knowing they would be analyzed by xenosociologists for centuries. But now, looking at ZYX's stellar eyes, he forgot the carefully crafted diplomatic language and spoke from the heart. "ZYX," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall's acoustic systems. "When I first saw you crying in that garden, I thought you were the most beautiful person I'd ever encountered. Nothing that's happened since then has changed that opinion. You're brilliant kind, creative, and brave enough to challenge systems that have oppressed people for millennia. I promise to stand with you, to support your work, and to keep telling you you're beautiful every day for the rest of our lives, no matter how many diplomatic incidents it causes. The laughter that rippled through the hall was warm and included harmonic frequencies from species that didn't technically laugh but were expressing amusement in their own ways. Zewixindra of the Luminari, the AI prompted, "Please state your commitment according to your cultural tradition and personal choice." Zewix had also prepared formal vows, but she too seemed to abandon her planned speech in favor of honesty. "Marcus," she said, her voice like wind chimes in a gentle breeze, "you saw me when everyone else saw only flaws. You offered kindness when my own people offered only exile. You changed not just my life, but my understanding of what life could be. I promise to challenge unjust systems with you, to build something better than what came before, and to help you understand just how extraordinary humans are, even when you don't realize it yourselves." Professor Zix of the Zephyrian Institute floated forward, their energy field crackling with ceremonial significance. The research conducted over the past month has confirmed what this union represents. Human aesthetic perception operates on fundamentally different principles from established galactic norms. This difference has the potential to reshape our understanding of beauty, value, and worth across all species. Logic Coordinator Prime Sequence Optimal Outcome activated a holographic display that filled the space above the altar. Statistical analysis indicates that human aesthetic judgment correlates with factors including emotional resonance, perceived kindness, intellectual compatibility, and cultural harmony rather than pure physical symmetry or species-standard proportional requirements. Marcus watched the data displays with fascination and growing understanding. The research hadn't just studied his attraction to ZYX. It had revealed that humans approached beauty entirely differently from the rest of the galaxy. In simpler terms, Ambassador Chan translated for the benefit of species less fond of statistical analysis. Humans fall in love with the whole person, not just their appearance. The implications were staggering. If human aesthetic perception was based on emotional and intellectual connection rather than pure physical criteria, it suggested that human-style beauty standards could potentially revolutionize how galactic society thought about relationships, social hierarchies, and individual worth. "Do you understand what you're agreeing to?" Ambassador Veltar asked, addressing both Marcus and ZYX, but clearly speaking for the record. "This union will set legal precedents for interspecies marriage, aesthetic evaluation protocols, and cultural exchange policies across the galaxy. Your relationship has become a model for potential social transformation." Marcus looked at ZYX, who was glowing with something that made the ceremonial starlight in her gown seem dim by comparison. "I understand that telling my future wife she's beautiful has somehow become a catalyst for galactic social revolution," Marcus said. "I understand that our marriage is going to be studied by scholars for the next 1,000 years. I understand that we're probably going to spend our honeymoon at academic conferences and diplomatic seminars." "And?" prompted the AI coordinator. "And I couldn't be happier about any of it," Marcus finished. "Because if our relationship can help other people find the kind of connection we've found, if it can challenge systems that make people feel worthless because of how they look, then it's worth all the complications." ZYX reached for his hands, her touch sending small sparkles of light through her fingertips. "Then we're ready." The actual moment of marriage involved a complex ritual that combined elements from dozens of traditions. There were harmonic resonances, energy field synchronization, logical commitment protocols, and, at Marcus's insistence, the exchange of rings that he'd had crafted by the station's best artisans from metals representing both Earth and the Luminari homeworld. When the AI coordinator finally announced, "The Union is formally recognized according to galactic law and cultural protocol," the celebration that erupted in the hall was unlike anything in diplomatic history. The Vithrak sang crystalline harmonies that made the walls ring like bells. The Zephyrians created light shows that turned the entire hall into a dancing aurora. The Krenari activated logical appreciation sequences that translated roughly to enthusiastic applause. Species that had never celebrated together were sharing in joy that transcended cultural barriers. But Marcus only had eyes for his wife, whose kiss tasted like starlight, and promises of adventures he couldn't imagine. As they broke apart, he became aware that the celebration was evolving into something else. Delegates were moving between species groups, talking animatedly about aesthetic theory and cultural exchange programs. He could see new alliances forming, new ideas being born. "What have we done?" ZYX whispered in his ear. "I think," Marcus said, watching Ambassador Veltar engage in what looked like intense philosophical debate with a Chronari logic specialist. "We've accidentally started a renaissance." The reception was a diplomatic marvel, with foods and entertainments from dozens of worlds. Marcus found himself in conversations with beings he'd only seen in textbooks, discussing aesthetic theory, cultural exchange, and the future of galactic civilization. But the moment that defined the evening came when a young Luminari approached their table. She was clearly nervous, her robes shifting through uncertain colors. "Honored Vyxandra," she said formally, "I wanted to thank you." "For what?" ZYX asked kindly. "For showing us that beauty can be different than we were taught. I've spent my life believing I was aesthetically deficient by our standards. Watching your ceremony, seeing how the other species reacted to you, made me realize that maybe the standards were the problem, not me." Marcus watched his wife's eyes fill with luminescent tears of joy as she embraced the young Luminari. Around the hall, he could see similar conversations happening. Beings who had felt excluded or diminished by their society's beauty standards were finding hope and validation. "I think this is just the beginning," Zawyak said later as they stood together on the observation deck, watching the alien sun set over the planet below. "The beginning of what?" "Everything," she said, leaning against him as her hair caught the last light of the day. "A new way of thinking about beauty, about worth, about what it means to be valued in a galactic community." Marcus wrapped his arms around his wife and watched the stars emerge in the alien sky. Somewhere out there, across the galaxy, news of their wedding was spreading. Social reformers were gaining momentum, discriminatory laws were being questioned, and millions of beings were beginning to see themselves and each other through new eyes. Not bad for a maintenance worker who just wanted to cheer up someone who was crying. "I love you," he told her, watching the way her skin reflected the starlight. "I love you too," she replied, "even if you did accidentally revolutionize galactic civilization." "That was an accident," Marcus protested. "I just think you're beautiful." "I know," Lyax said, her smile bright enough to outshine the stars. "That's exactly why it worked." As they stood together on the observation deck of humanity's first embassy to the stars, Marcus realized that sometimes the most important moments in history started with the simplest acts of kindness. Sometimes telling the truth about what you saw when you looked at someone could change the entire galaxy. Sometimes love really could conquer all, even when all included 5,000 years of entrenched cultural prejudice. But then, humans had always been good at doing impossible things. 6 months after what historians were already calling the aesthetic revolution, Marcus stood in the observation lounge of the newly established Institute for Cultural Aesthetic Research, watching construction drones build humanity's first permanent research facility in deep space. The irony that he now held the title of Director of Human Perception Studies was not lost on him, though he still insisted on maintaining the environmental systems himself. The Institute was a marvel of cooperative engineering, designed and built by a consortium of 17 different species who had pooled their technologies to create something unprecedented. Zephyrian energy fields provided power. Vithrak crystalline matrices handled data processing. Chronari logic systems managed operations. And human intuition guided the overall design philosophy. The result was a structure that looked like a dream made solid, beautiful to every species that looked upon it. "The morning briefing packets," Zawyak announced, gliding into the lounge with her arms full of holographic data displays and traditional paper reports. As the Institute's director of interspecies aesthetic analysis, she had quickly become one of the most sought-after researchers in the galaxy. 47 new research applications, 12 diplomatic requests for consultation, and 3 marriage proposals. "Marriage proposals?" Marcus asked, looking up from his coffee and the maintenance schedule he'd been reviewing. "For us, not for me individually," Zawyak clarified with amusement. "Apparently our success has inspired other interspecies couples to seek formal recognition. The Diplomatic Council is setting up a whole new department to handle cross-species relationship protocols. Marcus shook his head in wonder. Every day brought new reminders of how far-reaching the consequences of that first conversation in the garden had become. The research they'd accidentally inspired had triggered social changes across the galaxy that were still rippling outward like waves from a dropped stone. "Any interesting cases in the new applications?" he asked. ZYX activated one of the holographic displays, showing a three-dimensional map dotted with indicators from across the galaxy. A hegemony energy worker wants to marry a chronari logic specialist. A Vithrak crystal singer is engaged to a gaseous ethereal. 3 different luminari have requested permission to establish relationships with members of species they were previously taught to consider aesthetically incompatible. "How's that going over with the traditional factions?" "About as well as you'd expect," ZYX said diplomatically. Ambassador Veltar sent another formal protest about the degradation of established aesthetic protocols, though he did also quietly submit a request for consultation regarding his own daughter's relationship with a human xenobiologist. Marcus laughed. The past 6 months had been a constant source of amazement as species after species discovered that their assumed beauty standards were far more flexible than they believed. What had started as a diplomatic crisis had evolved into the largest social transformation in galactic history. Dr. Velthara materialized in the lounge, her crystalline form chiming with excited harmonics. As the Institute's chief research coordinator, she had been documenting the aesthetic revolution with scientific rigor. Marcus and ZYX, she harmonized in greeting, "Today's data compilation is remarkable. Statistical analysis indicates accelerating adoption of human-style aesthetic evaluation protocols across 43 species." "Show me," Marcus said, setting down his coffee. Even after all this time, the scope of change they'd helped trigger still amazed him. The holographic display transformed into a complex visualization showing social and cultural shifts across the galaxy. Color-coded indicators showed where traditional beauty hierarchies were being challenged, where new interspecies relationships were forming, and where discriminatory laws were being overturned. The hegemony of scales formally abolished appearance-based citizenship requirements last week, Dr. Velthara reported. The Zephyrian Energy Collective established new guidelines that prioritize harmonic compatibility over visual conformity. Even the chronari have updated their logical frameworks to include emotional resonance as a valid criterion for partnership evaluation. Marcus studied the data, still struggling to believe that his simple act of kindness had cascaded into galactic social reform. How many species have implemented some kind of aesthetic diversity protection laws? 31 so far, with 14 more in various stages of legislative process. The most significant development is the emergence of what researchers are calling human-style relationship formation among species who had never previously considered cross-cultural partnerships. ZYX moved closer to study the visualization. The luminary data is particularly interesting. Despite official resistance from the traditional aesthetic councils, individual luminari are increasingly forming relationships based on what they call human perception principles rather than classical beauty standards. "What does that mean practically?" Marcus asked. "It means," Professor Zix announced as they crackled into the lounge in their energy field manifestation, "that young luminari are choosing partners based on intellectual compatibility, emotional resonance, and shared values rather than conformity to traditional appearance standards. The same pattern is appearing across multiple species." Marcus looked around at his colleagues, beings from across the galaxy who had become not just research partners, but genuine friends. "Are we sure this is all good? I mean, we're essentially overturning thousands of years of cultural tradition." "Some traditions deserve to be overturned," ZYX said firmly, "especially traditions that cause suffering and exclusion." Logic Coordinator Prime Sequence Optimal Outcome materialized via holographic projection from the chronari homeworld, where they were presenting their research to the Grand Logic Council. Update from chronari evaluation proceedings. Traditional aesthetic protocols demonstrated mathematically inefficient for optimal relationship formation. Human perception models show superior correlation between partner compatibility and long-term relationship success. Official recommendation: adopt human-style aesthetic evaluation as preferred logical framework. The chronari are recommending emotional compatibility over logical aesthetics. Marcus asked incredulously. That might be the most revolutionary thing yet. It's certainly the most surprising, ZYX agreed. Though the ethereal collective's decision to establish physical manifestation protocols for interspecies relationships might be more practically significant. Marcus remembered meeting his first ethereal just last week, a gaseous being who had somehow managed to maintain a coherent humanoid form long enough to attend one of their research presentations. The implications of non-physical species developing physical manifestation abilities just to participate in the new relationship paradigms were staggering. There's something else. Dr. Veltharaz's harmonics shifted to more serious tones. We've detected organized opposition to the aesthetic revolution. Conservative factions from multiple species are coordinating resistance efforts. What kind of resistance? Marcus asked, though he suspected he didn't want to know. Professor Zix's energy field darkened. Economic pressure on species governments, attempts to discredit research findings, and, in some cases, direct threats against individuals who have formed cross-species relationships. ZYX's expression grew concerned. How direct? 3 mixed couples have reported harassment. 2 research facilities have experienced suspicious equipment failures. And there's been an increase in what can only be described as aesthetic fundamentalist rhetoric across multiple species communication networks. Marcus felt a familiar chill. He'd been hoping that the positive changes they'd helped inspire would continue spreading without serious opposition, but he should have known that entrenched power structures wouldn't give up without a fight. What's being done about it? The Galactic Council has established a special security committee, Dr. Velthara reported. They're treating threats against interspecies couples as diplomatic incidents. Your marriage created legal precedents that make discrimination against aesthetic diversity a violation of galactic law. So we're protected by the same laws that our situation helped create? Marcus asked. Protected, yes, but also targeted, ZYX said quietly. We're symbols now, whether we wanted to be or not. Our relationship represents the challenge to traditional hierarchies. That makes us both powerful and vulnerable. Before Marcus could respond, their communication system chimed with an incoming priority message. Ambassador Chen's image appeared in the holographic display, and her expression was serious. Marcus, ZYX, we need to talk. There's been a development that affects the future of the aesthetic revolution, and we need your input on how to respond. What kind of development? ZYX asked. The kind that could either accelerate social change across the galaxy or bring the whole movement to a halt, Chen replied. The traditional Aesthetic Preservation Alliance has formally challenged the legal basis for interspecies marriages in a galactic court. They're using your marriage as the test case. Marcus felt the familiar sensation of the universe shifting around him. They're challenging our marriage? They're challenging the entire legal framework that recognizes aesthetic diversity as a valid basis for relationship formation. If they win, it could undo everything that's been accomplished over the past 6 months. The lounge fell silent except for the hum of the Institute systems. Marcus looked around at his colleagues, at the research facility they'd built together, at the visual evidence of social changes spreading across the galaxy. All of it was potentially at risk because conservative forces wanted to maintain the status quo. What happens if they win? He asked. Interspecies marriages based on human aesthetic principles could be declared invalid, Ambassador Chen explained. Species could legally revert to traditional beauty hierarchies. The research programs could be shut down. Beings who have formed relationships or changed their lives based on aesthetic diversity principles could find themselves without legal protection. Marcus thought about all the couples who had reached out to them, all the individuals who had found new confidence and self-worth through challenging traditional beauty standards, all the species that were beginning to see themselves and others through more compassionate eyes. When is the hearing? He asked. 3 weeks. And Marcus? The Alliance is demanding that you and ZYX testify about the motivations for your marriage. They want to prove that human aesthetic perception is too alien to serve as a basis for galactic relationship standards. Marcus looked at ZYX, at her stellar eyes and liquid silver hair, at the being whose beauty had started this entire revolution. What do you think? I think, ZYX said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they faced, that we've come too far to back down now. Too many people are counting on the changes we've helped create. The scientific evidence is overwhelming. Dr. Velthera harmonized with determination. Human aesthetic perception demonstrably produces more successful relationship outcomes. Logic supports aesthetic diversity principles. Emotional resonance data confirms superior compatibility metrics. Added logic coordinator prime sequence optimal outcome. Professor Zix's energy field brightened with resolve. The research stands on its own merit. Conservative resistance cannot overcome objective evidence. Marcus looked around the lounge again, at the star field visible through the observation windows, at the data displays showing positive changes spreading across the galaxy. 6 months ago, he'd been a maintenance worker whose biggest worry was keeping the air conditioning running. Now, he was facing a legal challenge that could determine the future of interspecies relations across the galaxy. "Okay," he said finally, "let's go defend our marriage and accidentally save galactic civilization one more time." "You realize," the YX said with a smile that made the stars outside seem dim, "that this is probably not how most honeymoon periods end. Most honeymoon periods don't accidentally trigger social revolutions," Marcus replied. "But then most marriages don't start with diplomatic incidents either." As they began planning their defense for what would certainly be the most important legal case in galactic history, Marcus reflected on how much his life had changed since that day in the garden when he'd heard someone crying and decided to see if he could help. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness had the largest consequences. Sometimes telling someone they were beautiful could change the entire galaxy. And sometimes, just sometimes, love really could conquer all, even when all included entrenched power structures, ancient prejudices, and the inertia of 5,000 years of tradition. The question now was whether it could also conquer a legal system designed to protect the status quo. Marcus suspected they were about to find out. But as he looked at ZYX, as he thought about all the beings across the galaxy who had found hope and validation through their story, he realized that regardless of what happened in court, they had already won. They had proven that beauty was in the eye of the beholder, that love could cross species barriers, and that sometimes the most profound revolutions started with the simplest human gesture. Even if the traditional Aesthetic Preservation Alliance succeeded in overturning their marriage legally, they couldn't undo the hearts and minds that had already been changed. They couldn't restore ignorance where knowledge had taken root. They couldn't make people unsee beauty where they had learned to find it. The aesthetic revolution would continue, legal challenges or not, because it was based on something more powerful than law or tradition. It was based on the fundamental human truth that everyone deserved to be seen as beautiful by someone, somewhere, somehow. And that truth, once released into the galaxy, was impossible to contain.